What we're going to do is we're going to graph piecewise functions. And when we're talking about a piecewise function, we're talking about two functions sharing a coordinate plane. One is going to be on the left-hand side, and the other one is going to be on the right-hand side. And that's going to be based off of our domain. If it's less than, it's on the left-hand side. If it's greater than, it's on the right-hand side. So starting with our first problem, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with a table of values. I'm going to start with my domain. So in this case, it is 1. And when I plug in a 1, 1 minus 3 is negative 2. Then I'm picking a number that is less than 1. So less than 1 would be 0. When I plug in a 0, 0 minus 3 is negative 3. So at 1, negative 2, I'm going to put an open circle. The reason that it's open is because if we look at our domain, what we notice is that it's less than, but it's not equal to, versus the other one it's going to be equal to. So we put an open circle. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plot 0, 3. And since it's a linear equation, we're drawing a straight line. For the second one, we're going to do the same thing. We look at our domain. We see that it is greater than or equal to 1. So we're going to put our table of values. We start with 1. When we plug in a 1, notice it's a constant at 2, so it stays 2. A number greater than 1 would be 2. Once again, it's a constant, so it stays as 2. So 1, 2, I put a closed circle. Once again, the reason that this is closed is because there's a line underneath. And then I plot 2, 2, and then I draw my graph. For the second one, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start off with my first one. Notice that this is now greater than, so this is going to be on the right-hand side. I have my table of values. I start with negative 2 because that's where my domain starts. When I plug in negative 2, negative negative is a positive, so that would be 4. Then I'm picking a number greater than negative 2, which is negative 1. When I plug in a negative 1, negative negative is a positive, so that would be 3. So at negative 2, 4, what I have is an closed circle. And the reason that it's closed is because there's a line underneath. And then I have negative 1 and 3. And I'm going to draw the line. For my second one, I do the same thing. I have my table of values. I start with my domain, which in this case is negative 2. When I plug in a negative 2, it stays negative 2. Then I want a number less than negative 2, so I'm going to pick negative 3. When I plug in a negative 3, I get a negative 3. So at negative 2, I have a open circle. Once again, it's open because there's no line underneath. And then I have negative 3, negative 3. And so that right there is my graph. Looking at letter C, we're doing the same thing. I'm going to have my chart. My domain starts at 0. So I have a 0 here. When I plug a 0 in, what I get is 1. Then what I'm going to do is plug a number greater than 0, which would be 1. Actually, I'm going to pick a 2 so I don't have a fraction. Once again, it just has to be greater than 0. So 1 works if you want, 2, 3, 4. When I plug in a 2, half of 2 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So 0, 1, I have a open circle. Then at 2, 2, I draw my line. For the next one, this one I'm going to pick 3 ordered pairs. And the reason why I have 3 instead of 2 is because this is the first one that's not linear. This is a quadratic equation. So with a linear equation, all we need are 2 points. For a quadratic, it's better to have 3. I'm going to start with 0 because that's where my domain is. If I plug in a 0, 0 squared is 0, minus 1 is negative 1. If I plug in a number less than 0, negative 1, negative 1 squared is 1, 1 minus 1 is 0. Then if I plug in a negative 2, negative 2 squared is 4, 4 minus 1 is 3. So I have 0, negative 1, which is a closed circle because there's a line underneath. Then I have negative 1, 0, and I have negative 2 and 3. And this right here is my quadratic. Looking at letter D, what I'm going to do is start off with my first one, which is 2. And when I plug in 2, it stays as negative 1. A number greater than 2 would be 3. Once again, it's constant, so it stays as negative 1. When I plot the point, I get 2, negative 1, which is an open circle. And then I have 3, negative 1, and I draw my line. For my second one, I start at 2 because that's where the domain starts me. When I plug in a 2, 2 times 2 is 4, minus 1 is 3. Pick a number less than 2, which is 1. When I plug in a 1, 2 times 1 is 2, minus 1 is 1. So I have 2, 3, which is a closed circle. Then I have 1, 1. So looking at the next one, what we have is starting at negative 1, because that's where our domain starts. If I plug in a negative 1, I get a negative 3. Then I'm going to pick a number less than negative 1, which is negative 2. When I plug in a negative 2, that's negative 6. With this one right here, I'm going to just move it up a little bit. So I have negative 1, negative 3, and it's going to be a closed circle. And then I have negative 2, negative 6. For the next one, when I plug in a negative 1, this is kind of an ugly one because negative negative is a positive, so I have 2/3 plus 2, which is 2 2/3. Sometimes it doesn't turn out as nice as I hope. A number greater than negative 1 would be 0. This is much nicer because when I plug in a 0, of course it's 0 plus 2, which is 2. So negative 1, 2 2/3, and then 0, 2, and that should have been an open circle. And then I draw my line. For the last one, first thing that I want to do is I want to pick my values for my table. So I'm going to start off with 1 because that's where my domain is. When I plug in a 1, 3 minus 1 is 2. A number greater than 1 is 2. So 3 minus 2 gives me 1. So at 1, 2, I have an open circle. Then at 2, 1, I draw my line. For the next one, because it's a quadratic, I'm going to pick 3 points. I'm going to start off with 1. And when I plug in a 1, remember I square it first and then I do the negative. So 1 squared is 1. Negative 1 plus 3 is 2. Then when I plug in a 0, 0 squared is 0, so that would be 3. And then when I plug in a negative 1, negative 1 squared is 1. That's negative 1 plus 3, which is 2. So I have 1, 2. I fill in the open circle, 0, 3, and then negative 1 and 2. And this one kind of looks a little bit like a fishhook.